Jasmine Carter sat calmly in the witness chair, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. The courtroom, packed with reporters and officials, buzzed with tension. Across from her, two white officers, Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks, sat stiffly in the defendant's seats, their usual air of authority replaced by barely concealed panic. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Carter, do you have anything to present before the court?" Jasmine exhaled slowly, reached into her blazer pocket, and withdrew a leather badge holder. The moment the CIA emblem flashed, gasps filled the room. Daly went pale. Brooks's fingers clenched around the table. Jasmine's voice was calm, but razor sharp. "Your Honor, these men knowingly detained me under false charges, obstructed a federal investigation, and fabricated evidence against me." The courtroom erupted. The officers, once so sure of their power, now sat frozen. They had no idea. They had picked the wrong woman to frame. Atlanta pulsed with the restless energy of a Monday morning. The streets hummed with the usual symphony, horns blaring in irritation, conversations blending into a low murmur, and the occasional frustrated sigh of a commuter trapped in the city's perpetual congestion. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the acrid fumes of traffic, wrapping the air in a paradox of comfort and suffocation. Jasmine Carter moved through the chaos with purpose. Dressed in a fitted navy suit, her heels clicked against the pavement in a steady rhythm, each step carrying the weight of certainty. The black leather briefcase in her grip was an extension of her presence, calculated, intentional. Everything about her spoke of quiet authority, from the poised way she adjusted her blazer to the unshaken focus in her deep brown eyes. The Thompson Federal Courthouse loomed ahead, a fortress of gray stone and unyielding bureaucracy. Justice was meant to live within its walls, but Jasmine had long since realized it was only a visitor, brief, conditional, and far too often denied to those who needed it most. She wasn't here for faith in the system. She was here to fight. Today's case was significant, one that could shift the scales in ways those in power would rather keep unbalanced. Inside her briefcase were documents that could dismantle careers, expose corruption, and bring long-buried truths to the surface. But it wasn't just about paperwork. It was about setting a precedent. She was only a few steps from the courthouse entrance when a voice cut through the air like a whip. "Hey, hands up!" Jasmine stopped mid-step. It wasn't the words themselves that sent a ripple through her composure. It was the tone. Sharp, authoritative. A command, not a request. The kind of voice that came with a badge and the unshaken belief that it never needed to explain itself. She turned slowly, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. Two white officers stood before her, their hands hovering near their holsters, as if she were a threat, not a woman on her way to work. Sergeant Rick Daly was built like a bulldozer, broad-shouldered with a permanent scowl that seemed etched into his face. His uniform was crisp, his stance aggressive, a man accustomed to power and unchallenged authority. Beside him, Officer Connor Brooks was younger, leaner, but with the same air of quiet entitlement, his gaze flicking to Jasmine's briefcase as if it held something dangerous. Jasmine knew their type. Different faces, same playbook. Daly stepped forward, puffing out his chest, just enough to make sure she saw the badge pinned to it, like it was a shield against accountability. "Ma'am, put the bag down and step back." His words were measured, but his stance was anything but relaxed. Jasmine arched an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly in a way that hinted at amusement rather than fear. "Excuse me? What's the issue?" Brooks shifted beside him, eyes scanning her as though expecting something. "What? Guilt? Panic? Submission?" "You match the description of a suspect involved in fraudulent government activity." For a moment, there was silence. Then Jasmine let out a low, humorless laugh. Fraudulent government activity. She let the words hang between them, absorbing the absurdity of it. A black woman, a tailored suit, a briefcase filled with official documents. That was all it took, wasn't it? Existing in the wrong skin, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Her gaze met Daly's, sharp and unwavering. Let me guess. Black woman, professional attire, carrying important-looking paperwork. That's the threat these days? Daly's jaw twitched. His patience was thin. Just cooperate, ma'am. There it was. Not a request, a demand. Jasmine's eyes flicked toward the courthouse doors. She was minutes away from stepping inside, from presenting evidence that would unravel a case she had spent months building. Instead, she was standing here, being treated like a criminal for merely existing. She exhaled, steadying herself. I don't have time for this. I work here. Daly didn't blink, didn't ask a follow-up question, didn't care, because black people explaining themselves to cops had never actually mattered. His hand moved to his cuffs. If you resist, it's obstruction, Brooks added, his voice almost casual, as if the threat of criminal charges was just another Monday morning routine. Jasmine's lips parted in something that resembled a smile. Obstruction, she echoed. That's cute. And what exactly am I obstructing? The fresh air? Daly's patience snapped. The cuffs were out. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't give them the reaction they expected. She simply lifted her hands and let it happen. Because she wasn't just playing their game. She was about to flip the entire board. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Jasmine's wrists, but she barely reacted. No struggle, no outburst, just an eerie, measured stillness. Sergeant Daly and Officer Brooks expected something different. They were used to resistance, to pleading, to outrage. That's what usually came next. But Jasmine gave them nothing. She wasn't interested in playing their game. She was rewriting the rules. Daly tightened his grip on her arm, guiding her toward their patrol car. His fingers pressed into her blazer, but Jasmine kept her posture flawless, her head high. It wasn't about ego. It was about something bigger. Let's go, Daly muttered, his voice laced with forced authority. But even he could feel it. Something wasn't right. Minutes earlier, on the courthouse steps, Jasmine had felt the weight of their gazes. Predatory, assessing, assuming. Daly's fingers twitched near his holster. Brooks stood just behind him, watching Jasmine's every movement, like she might morph into something dangerous at any moment. Put the bag down and step away, Daly ordered again, voice clipped. Jasmine held her ground. She knew the script, the same one that played out in cities across America. The officers were waiting for hesitation, waiting for fear, waiting for her to stumble over her own explanation so they could justify what they had already decided to do. Instead, she exhaled, slow and deliberate. No. Brooks stiffened. Daly's brow twitched. They weren't used to hearing that word. Excuse me? Daly's voice dropped into something colder, something meant to intimidate. Jasmine tilted her head. I asked what the issue was. You said I matched the description of a suspect. That's vague. That's lazy. You're going to need to do better than that. Brooks's jaw tightened. You're being uncooperative. There it was, the go-to phrase. Jasmine almost laughed. She had spent years studying cases like this. Officers weren't trained to de-escalate. They were trained to control. If you questioned them, you were hostile. If you didn't comply fast enough, you were resisting. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. The moment they decided she was a problem, she was one. Open the briefcase, Daly demanded. Jasmine arched an eyebrow. No warrant? No probable cause? You think I'm just going to hand over privileged legal documents because you asked nicely? Brooks stepped forward, close enough that she could smell his department-issued coffee breath. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, ma'am. Jasmine shook her head slightly, her smile cold. I prefer the legal way. For a split second, there was hesitation. Brooks glanced at Daly. Good. It wasn't much, but it was a crack. A sign that they weren't sure if this was worth it. That maybe, just maybe, they had miscalculated. But Daly doubled down. Men like him always did. She's stalling, Daly snapped. We'll take her in, sort it out at the station. Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Decision made. Jasmine had expected this. The cuffs locked around her wrists, sharp and unyielding. A few people on the courthouse steps paused, watching, their expressions wary. But no one moved to intervene. Jasmine felt their eyes. The silent calculation. Is she dangerous? Is she guilty? Or is she just another black woman who crossed the wrong line? Daly straightened, satisfied with himself. He had won this round, or so he thought. Let's go, he grunted, gripping her arm. Jasmine let herself be led. She didn't fight. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Because this wasn't the fight. Not yet. This was their move. But the next one? That belonged to her. The air in the holding cell was thick with the familiar scent of sweat, stale coffee, and cheap disinfectant. The walls were gray, the bench cold and unforgiving beneath Jasmine's posture-perfect frame. She sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap, as if she were waiting for a meeting rather than being detained under false charges. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't angry. She was listening. Just beyond the heavy metal bars, Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks were talking. Arrogant, careless, certain she had already lost. You see the documents she had? Brooks muttered, voice just low enough to feel conspiratorial. Daly exhaled sharply. Yeah, we just say she tried to pass them off as real clearance files. Jasmine's fingers curled slightly. Oh, so that was the play. They weren't just detaining her. They were framing her. Forgery. Impersonating a federal officer. Two neat little charges that would hold just long enough to keep her locked away while they buried whatever case she had been about to bring to court. Jasmine closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the weight of it. Not because she was afraid, not because she was surprised, because she was tired. Tired of the same old script. Men like Daly and Brooks had existed for centuries. Different faces, same mentality. Badge-heavy men who bent the law around their will, who saw truth as something to be manipulated, not upheld. They planted evidence, twisted facts, rewrote history with every sworn testimony that went unquestioned, and they thought today would be no different. Daly's voice lowered, but she still caught the edge of his words. She's a nobody. Judge will believe us. They always do. Nobody. Jasmine inhaled slowly through her nose. Oh, they had no idea who they were dealing with. She could have spoken then, could have shattered their confidence with a single well-placed revelation. But she didn't. Let them talk. Let them dig their own graves. She wasn't just waiting for justice, she was orchestrating it. Jasmine remained motionless, keeping her expression unreadable even as footsteps approached. The door to the holding area swung open with a metallic groan, and a new voice entered the mix. Is she ready for processing? Another officer. A different voice, but the same indifference. To them, she was just another case number, another inconvenience to be handled before lunch. Daly's response was casual, dismissive. Yeah, she'll be held overnight until we file the charges. Jasmine almost smiled. They really thought this was going to stick. But she knew something they didn't. They weren't in control anymore. She straightened her back just slightly, exhaling with quiet patience, because any minute now, the real game was about to begin. The air in the precinct felt different before the door even opened. A shift, a momentary pause, as if the very walls sensed something was about to change. Then it happened. The door to the holding area slammed open, the sound reverberating through the small, dimly lit space like a gavel striking wood. Enter Marcus Bell. He didn't just step inside. He took the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit so sharp it looked like it could slice through steel, Marcus moved with the ease of a man who had never known what it meant to ask permission. His presence wasn't just commanding. It was undeniable. His reputation preceded him. A legal powerhouse, undefeated in cases that made lesser attorneys fold under pressure. The kind of lawyer whose name sent shivers down the spines of prosecutors and left judges double-checking their rulings. And right now, this precinct belonged to him. Sergeant Rick Daly turned, his scowl instinctive, but Marcus didn't even glance in his direction. His eyes were locked on the desk sergeant, who barely had time to open his mouth before Marcus was already speaking. "I'm here for Jasmine Carter." The words weren't a request. They were a statement of fact, a reminder of inevitability. The desk sergeant cleared his throat. "She's being processed." Marcus didn't let him finish. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, slamming it down onto the desk with a decisive thud. The papers inside were neatly stacked, precise. A legal sledgehammer disguised as a manila folder. Daly frowned, stepping closer. "What's this?" Marcus leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words feel dangerous. "Just a little something from the Department of Justice." Daly's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched. The first crack. Brooks shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Marcus and the folder. He felt it too. The room tilted. Marcus straightened, adjusting his cuffs like he had all the time in the world. "Turns out Miss Carter isn't just some civilian you can throw in a cell. She's a consultant on federal security clearance cases." The silence that followed was beautiful. Daly's scowl deepened, but his complexion had gone 2 shades lighter. Brooks exhaled sharply, the reality settling in. They hadn't arrested just anyone. They had arrested the one person who could unravel them. Brooks was the first to speak, his voice forced, brittle. "That doesn't mean she didn't." Marcus lifted a single finger. One simple finger. And Brooks shut up. The silence stretched, Marcus letting the moment sink in. And then, with deliberate slowness, he spoke again. "And that fraudulent document you claim she had?" He let the question hover, hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Daly's lips pressed into a thin line. He already knew. Marcus smiled, slow and sharp. "It was meant for today's federal court hearing." Brooks swallowed. Daly clenched his jaw. The realization hit them all at once. They hadn't just arrested an innocent woman. They had obstructed a federal investigation. Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You two really know how to pick 'em." The desk sergeant cleared his throat awkwardly, glancing between them. "I think we need to—" "You need to release my client. Now." Marcus's voice was steel, not a single ounce of room for argument. For the first time since placing those cuffs on Jasmine Carter, Daly hesitated. He had spent his entire career in control, walking into courtrooms as the accuser, not the accused. But today, he wasn't holding the power anymore, and he felt it. Marcus smirked. "Oh, you think this is over?" Daly and Brooks exchanged nervous glances, because for the first time since this all began, they understood. They had just made the worst mistake of their lives. The Thompson Federal Courthouse had seen its fair share of high-stakes cases, but today, the weight in the air was different. It wasn't just another trial. It was an execution. And for once, the executioners weren't the ones in uniform. Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks sat rigid in the defendant's seats, their usual air of authority replaced with a thin veneer of control. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the kind of anticipation that crackled like static before a storm. They still thought they could talk their way out of this. They had spent years winning inside rooms like this, where their words were taken as gospel. where their version of the truth was the only one that mattered. But today, something was different. Because today, Jasmine Carter was walking in free. The air shifted the moment the doors swung open. Jasmine Carter entered. No cuffs, no panic, no fear. Her stride was slow, deliberate. The kind of confidence that wasn't borrowed but owned. She didn't rush. She didn't have to. Because today, the room adjusted to her. She walked past the rows of spectators, attorneys, reporters, officials, each one watching her with rapt attention. Some whispered, others just stared. Even Judge Harris, a seasoned woman who had seen every trick in the book, took a moment to adjust her glasses, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she observed the shift in power. At the defense table, Marcus Bell sat casually, flipping through a folder like he already knew the ending to this story. Because he did. At the prosecution's table, the district attorney fumbled with his paperwork, as if a new piece of evidence might magically appear to save them. And at the center of it all, Daly and Brooks. They didn't turn to look at her, but she saw it. The stiffness in their shoulders, the way Brooks's fingers twitched slightly against his lap. They weren't used to this. They were used to walking into courtrooms as the accusers, not the accused. She reached the witness stand, settling into her seat without hesitation. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. Her entire presence dared them to underestimate her one last time. Judge Harris leaned forward slightly. "Miss Carter, I understand you have something to present before the court." Jasmine nodded, exhaling slowly. And then she pulled out the bombshell. She reached into her blazer pocket. Daly's jaw clenched. Brooks flinched. The district attorney's eyes darted to the judge, as if silently asking for permission to stop whatever was about to happen. And then, with one swift, deliberate motion, Jasmine pulled out her CIA clearance badge and placed it gently on the stand. The room exploded. Gasps, murmurs, a slow-building wave of realization that crashed down all at once. Daly's face went white. Brooks looked like someone had just yanked the ground out from under him. The district attorney scrambled, flipping through files, looking for something, anything, that could salvage this wreckage. And Jasmine? Jasmine just smiled. Not big, not dramatic, just enough. Enough to say, "You played the wrong game with the wrong woman." She let the noise die down, then spoke, her voice even. "Your Honor, these men knowingly detained me under false charges, obstructed a federal investigation, and fabricated evidence against me." Silence. Then, chaos. The district attorney fumbled for control. Judge Harris slammed her gavel. Spectators whispered. Attorneys muttered. But Daly and Brooks? They sat frozen, like men who had just realized they'd been dead from the moment they put those cuffs on her. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Daly's. "And here's the best part." Her voice softened, not out of kindness, out of certainty. "I was already investigating them." Daly's breath hitched. Brooks let out a shaky exhale. They didn't just lose, they had walked straight into their own downfall. The weight of Jasmine's revelation hung heavy in the courtroom. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, an unnatural, suffocating stillness that gripped every person in attendance. Then, the whispers began. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. Court officials exchanged wide-eyed glances. The spectators murmured in stunned disbelief. The woman they had dismissed, arrested, and accused was no ordinary civilian. She was a high-level federal consultant. And the two men who had placed her in cuffs? They were now the ones on trial. Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks sat rigid in their seats, their faces pale, their hands clenched into fists. For years, they had walked into courtrooms like this one with complete confidence. They had testified against defendants with ease, knowing their words carried weight. Today, however, was different. Because they weren't the enforcers of justice. They were the ones being exposed. Daly's jaw tightened as he stared at Jasmine, his mind racing, searching for a way out. Beside him, Brooks's leg bounced under the table, a telltale sign of nerves. He swallowed hard, shifting in his chair, but he could feel it, the walls closing in. This wasn't supposed to happen. They had controlled the narrative. They had built careers on their words being the final authority. But not today. Today, they had no control. And Jasmine Carter was about to take everything from them. The district attorney cleared his throat, flipping through files with desperation, not confidence. He knew. He had walked into this case thinking it was a routine prosecution, an open and shut matter where the officer's testimony would be enough to convict. Now, he was staring at a disaster. He looked up at Jasmine, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something behind his eyes, uncertainty. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice carefully measured, "you're claiming that you were already investigating these officers?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly, an almost amused expression playing at her lips. "Claiming?" she repeated. The courtroom stilled. Jasmine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second folder. Marcus Bell, sitting beside her, didn't even look surprised. Daly and Brooks? Their faces drained of color. She opened the folder with slow precision, letting the anticipation build. Inside, neatly stacked and secured with official federal seals, were documents detailing her ongoing investigation into corrupt law enforcement practices. She lifted a single sheet, holding it up for the court to see. "These," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, "are records of internal complaints, reports, and active cases involving these two men." She let that sink in. Cases dating back 5 years. Daly let out a sharp breath. Brooks shifted, his gaze darting around the room like a cornered animal. They knew what was coming, and they were powerless to stop it. The district attorney's face hardened. He knew there was no salvaging this case. Still, he tried. There must be some... He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Misunderstanding." Jasmine smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "Is that so?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because the misunderstanding seems to be on your part." She tapped the papers. "This is federal evidence. Evidence that these men knowingly detained me under false pretenses, obstructed an active investigation, and fabricated charges to justify their actions." Judge Harris raised an eyebrow, looking toward the district attorney. "Well?" The DA hesitated, stammered. He had nothing. No defense, no excuse, no lifeline. Just the undeniable truth staring him in the face. The judge exhaled sharply, then turned her gaze toward Daly and Brooks. "You will both stand." The officers hesitated. For a fraction of a second, they considered refusing. But they knew. They had no choice. Slowly, stiffly, they rose. The courtroom was dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, Judge Harris delivered her verdict. "Charges against Miss Carter are dropped," she declared. "And effective immediately, this court will move forward with formal proceedings against Officers Daly and Brooks for obstruction of justice, false imprisonment, and abuse of power." Jasmine exhaled quietly, but she wasn't surprised. She had never doubted the outcome. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their microphones. Spectators murmured, their voices rising in disbelief. The district attorney rubbed a hand over his face, realizing the political nightmare unfolding before him. And in the middle of it all, two men who had once carried themselves with absolute authority now looked like ghosts of their former selves. Daly's face was flushed with barely contained rage, but it was useless. He was done. Brooks looked utterly lost, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he could hold on to his old life if he just clenched hard enough. But it was over. They were no longer officers, they were defendants. And they knew. just as everyone else in the courtroom did. This was only the beginning of their fall. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courtroom like an approaching storm. The reporters, the attorneys, the spectators, everyone knew they were witnessing something rare, something irreversible. Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks weren't just losing a case, they were losing everything. Jasmine Carter sat poised on the witness stand, her fingers resting lightly on the folder before her. She wasn't hurried, she wasn't rattled, she was exactly where she needed to be. Across the room, Daly and Brooks looked like men trapped in a burning house, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Jasmine's voice was cool, unwavering. "I didn't just find myself in their custody by accident," she said, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "I was already investigating them." Daly flinched. Brooks stopped breathing. Judge Harris narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Jasmine opened the folder again, pulling out more documents. Reports, witness statements, official complaints. She lifted the first sheet. "Here is a report from 3 years ago. A civilian detained without cause, held overnight, released without charge." She lifted another. A year later, same pattern. A different black professional falsely accused of a crime that didn't exist. No body cams, no paperwork filed. Another, and another. Case after case, the same names appearing. Daly, Brooks, Daly, Brooks. A pattern too obvious to ignore. And the final, crushing piece of evidence. Jasmine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a flash drive. She held it up. "This contains surveillance footage from the courthouse steps, video evidence that proves they detained me without just cause." The district attorney sank into his seat. Daly clenched his fists. Brooks looked physically ill. And then Jasmine delivered the final, unforgiving truth. "I didn't just come here for my case today." She let the silence build before dropping the hammer. "I came here to expose them." The courtroom felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls were closing in on the two men who had once believed they were untouchable. Daly's composure cracked. His face flushed red, but not from anger, from fear. Brooks, usually cocky and composed, was gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath was shallow, unsteady. They knew. They had walked right into their own downfall. Jasmine had never been the victim. She had been the executioner. Judge Harris leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers thoughtfully against her desk. She had been on the bench for decades. She had seen her fair share of power plays, legal maneuvers, and courtroom tricks. But this was justice in its purest form. She turned her sharp gaze toward Daly and Brooks. "Stand." Neither of them moved. "I said, stand." Slowly, stiffly, they rose to their feet. The entire courtroom held its breath. Judge Harris exhaled, then delivered her ruling with absolute finality. "Sergeant Rick Daly and Officer Connor Brooks, you are hereby placed under immediate federal investigation for corruption, false imprisonment, and obstruction of justice." Brooks made a strangled noise, like he wanted to protest, but there was nothing to say. Daly opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't speak, because there was no argument to make. Two uniformed officers stepped forward. Daly and Brooks stiffened. For years, they had been the ones making arrests. Now, the cuffs were for them. The same metal restraints they had snapped around Jasmine's wrists hours earlier were now being secured around their own. A full-circle moment, and Jasmine never even had to touch them. The officers led them toward the exit. Daly kept his head down. Brooks stared straight ahead, blank, like a man who had just lost everything. And just before they disappeared from sight, Jasmine met Daly's gaze. No words were needed. The look alone was enough. "You should have known better." Then they were gone. Justice, finally, had been served. The courtroom air still crackled with energy. the kind that lingers in the aftermath of something monumental. A shift had taken place. The weight of truth had pressed down, unraveled lies, and left two men in ruins. Jasmine Carter didn't watch them go. She didn't need to. She knew what had just happened, what it meant. And she wasn't the kind of woman who lingered in victories. She simply moved forward. The murmur of reporters swelled around her, voices trying to push through the tension. But Jasmine remained focused. She reached for her briefcase, snapping it shut with a quiet click. The weight in her hands wasn't just legal documents anymore. It was justice. She adjusted her blazer with practiced ease, smoothing out the fabric like she was preparing for just another day at work. Because in her mind, this wasn't revenge. This was correction. She had walked into this courthouse in handcuffs. She was walking out in power. Daly and Brooks shuffled forward under the firm grip of the federal officers escorting them. Their badges had been stripped from their chests, their service weapons confiscated, the authority they had wielded so carelessly, gone. No more false arrests, no more intimidation tactics, no more power plays. All that remained was the long road of accountability. Brooks's face was blank, his gaze unfocused, as if his mind refused to accept reality. Daly, however, looked straight ahead, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might snap. For years, he had walked through courtrooms like this with an untouchable air, knowing that his uniform shielded him from consequences. Now, he was just another man facing judgment. The cameras flashed as they stepped through the doors, their final moments of freedom captured for the world to see. As the door shut behind them, the tension in the room finally released. Conversations erupted, reporters scrambled, lawyers whispered. But Jasmine? She just exhaled, long and slow, before finally stepping away from the witness stand. Marcus Bell fell into step beside her, matching her stride effortlessly. He was grinning, his sharp suit still impeccable, his presence just as commanding as when he first walked into the station. "You know," he said, tucking his hands into his pockets, "I had about 5 different speeches prepared for that cross-examination." Jasmine smirked. "And you didn't need a single one." He let out a low chuckle. "Nope, you handled it just fine without me." They reached the courthouse steps, the warm sun spilling onto the pavement, the same spot where the day had started, with cuffs and accusations. But now Jasmine Carter was free. Marcus glanced over at her. "So," he flashed that infuriatingly smooth grin. "Lunch?" Jasmine tilted her head, pretending to consider it, before finally letting her lips curve into a small smirk. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just kept walking, because she never looked back. Atlanta didn't stop. Not for trials, not for fallen officers, not for justice finally served. The city kept moving, just as it always did. Cars honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, the air thick with the scent of street food and exhaust. To most people, today was just another day. But for those who had witnessed it, those who had been in that courtroom, those who had seen 2 men fall from power and a woman rise in its place, they knew better. Today had changed something, even if the city didn't pause to acknowledge it. Jasmine Carter moved through the crowd with purpose, not hesitation. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't reveling in the downfall of 2 corrupt officers, because this wasn't about them. It never had been. This was about a system that needed to be exposed, a system that had allowed Daly and Brooks to thrive for years. This wasn't the first battle she had fought, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, she had won. She adjusted her briefcase strap, letting the weight settle against her palm. Inside were the documents that had changed everything. Proof, evidence, truth. And she wasn't done yet, not even close. She reached the corner, waiting as the traffic light flickered from red to green. The hum of the city surrounded her, so alive, so indifferent. But Jasmine Carter? She wasn't indifferent. She was intentional. She had walked into the courthouse as the accused. She had walked out as the victor. And she didn't need to look back to know it. She never did. She simply stepped forward, moving on to the next fight. Because justice never asked for permission, and neither did she.